How do you survive a blizzard that drives temperatures below -20 degrees? Without electricity, without insulation foam, without furnaces, without modern clothing? Not for a few desperate hours. Not for a single night in a fragile emergency shelter, but for entire winters. With children who cannot afford mistakes, with elders whose bodies no longer recover from cold, with livestock close enough that their survival determines your own. For Viking families, this was not a thought experiment. It was daily reality across Scandinavia, Iceland, Greenland, and the North Atlantic world. Winters long enough to erase the sun from the sky. Winds strong enough to strip heat from exposed skin in minutes. Storms that did not forgive error, exhaustion, or optimism. And yet, the archaeological record tells a story modern survival culture rarely expects. Viking families did not merely endure these conditions. They lived inside them. They worked, slept, raised children, cared for elders, and planned future seasons within spaces that remained warm, stable, and survivable. Not through brute toughness. Not through endless fires. Not through suffering as a badge of honor. They survived through systems. Homes designed around heat. Materials chosen for memory, not strength. Daily habits shaped by physics rather than comfort. And communities that treated warmth as something shared, not owned. Which leads to a question that unsettles modern confidence. If families 1,000 years ago could engineer winter survival using only wood, stone, wool, earth, and cooperation, why do so many modern people become helpless the moment the grid goes dark? The answer is not a lack of strength. It is the loss of knowledge we no longer realize we depend on. To understand how Viking families stayed alive through brutal winters, one modern assumption has to be set aside. The belief that winter is something to fight. The Vikings did not fight winter. They designed around it. Archaeology makes this clear. Viking longhouses were not improvised shelters thrown together in desperation. They were carefully tuned thermal systems. Every beam, every wall thickness, every floor depth, and every daily routine interacted directly with the behavior of heat itself. Heat obeys only a few simple rules. It radiates outward from a source. It conducts through materials, and it convects, rising and escaping if left unchecked. The Vikings never wrote these principles down, but their buildings prove they understood them deeply. Their homes trapped radiant heat where human bodies actually lived. They slowed convection so warmth did not rush upward and disappear into the roof. They stored heat in materials that released it slowly, allowing fires to work less while warmth worked longer. Winter, to them, was not a hostile force pounding at the walls. It was a constant pressure, predictable, measurable, and manageable. Once winter was understood as a system rather than an enemy, fear gave way to design. And that single shift in mindset shaped every decision that followed. Modern survival advice almost always begins with a single instruction: build a fire. The Vikings understood something most modern people do not. Fire alone does not keep you warm. A fire produces intense heat, but it is wildly inefficient. Most of its energy rises immediately, vanishing into the air above. What remains often burns oxygen faster than it warms bodies. Left unmanaged, a fire becomes unstable, too hot, too smoky, or too dangerous to maintain through long nights. Viking hearths were never designed as roaring infernos. They were controlled cores. Archaeology reveals what that control looked like in practice. Behind Viking hearths, excavations consistently uncover wooden plank walls, stacked stones, and upright logs positioned with intention. These were not structural leftovers or decoration. They were reflectors. Radiant heat moves in straight lines. When it strikes a dense surface, it rebounds. Viking reflector walls captured heat that would have been lost and pushed it back into the living space. One fire became two sources of warmth, the flame itself and the invisible wave of energy returning to human bodies. This changed everything inside the longhouse. Women could weave wool near the hearth without pressing dangerously close to open flames. Children slept within the heat field instead of shivering at its edge. Airflow slowed. Drafts weakened. Warmth stayed low, where people actually lived and breathed. With a single architectural decision, Vikings doubled heating efficiency without burning more wood, risking fewer sparks, and consuming less oxygen. That insight control over raw heat became the foundation for every system that followed. Fire dies. Stone remembers. This quiet truth sits at the heart of Viking winter survival. Excavations of longhouses repeatedly reveal heated stones placed beneath benches, beside sleeping areas, and embedded within shallow hearth pits. These stones were not debris or accidental leftovers. They were moved with purpose. Vikings rolled dense stones directly into the fire, allowing them to drink in heat slowly. Once saturated, the stones were repositioned, tucked beneath bodies, near resting places, and along areas where warmth was needed most. This was not about convenience. It was about storage. Stone has high thermal mass. It absorbs heat gradually and releases it just as slowly. While flames flickered, weakened, or died entirely, the stones continued radiating warmth long into the night. Heat did not vanish with the fire. It lingered. This mattered most when tending flames became dangerous or impossible. At night, when exhaustion set in. During storms, when sparks threatened roofs. When elders needed steady warmth without sitting beside open embers. When children slept safely without smoke stinging their lungs. Heat stopped being volatile. It became predictable. Across the world, the same solution appears again and again. Siberian herders, plains, tribes, highland farmers, different cultures, different landscapes, identical physics. People who survived winter learned to store heat instead of chasing it, because heat that is stored can be controlled, and heat that is controlled keeps people alive. A fire warms your face. Insulation keeps you alive. The Vikings understood this difference with absolute clarity. Viking homes were lined with animal hides, reindeer, sheep, seal layered beneath benches, draped along walls, and spread across packed earth floors. These hides were not decoration, and they were not comfort items alone. They were biological technology. Hides worked because they trapped air, and air, not fabric, is the true insulator. Fur fibers create millions of tiny pockets that slow convection, preventing warm air from escaping and cold air from penetrating. Heat stays where human bodies need it most. Without insulation, a Viking longhouse would have been little more than a smoky barn. With it, the structure became a thermal envelope. This same principle shaped Viking clothing. Wool cloaks, dense and rich in natural lanolin, resisted moisture while maintaining loft. Even when damp from snow or condensation, wool continued to insulate, something many modern synthetic fabrics still struggle to achieve. Nothing here was accidental. Materials were chosen not for softness or appearance, but for how they behaved in cold, wet environments. Insulation was layered, maintained, and repaired as carefully as any tool. It was not a luxury. It was infrastructure, and without it, no amount of fire would have been enough. Another detail appears again and again in Viking architecture, so consistent that it can no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The fire sat low. Viking hearths were carved directly into earth floors, ringed by packed soil or stone rather than lifted onto raised platforms. This placement was deliberate. Cold air moves along the ground, slipping through cracks and open spaces. By placing fire at ground level or slightly below it, the Vikings reduced airflow disruption and prevented drafts from stealing heat before it could warm the living space. The pit hearth did more than hold flames. It concentrated embers. Coals were shielded from shifting air and sudden gusts, allowing fires to smolder steadily instead of burning out too quickly or flaring dangerously. Heat became slow and reliable rather than violent and unpredictable. Smoke management followed the same logic. Instead of tall chimneys that pulled warm air straight out of the house, Viking longhouses used small roof vents. These openings released smoke gradually while slowing heat loss. Air remained breathable, but warmth lingered where people lived. The fire was never meant to dominate the space. It was meant to anchor it. Set low, protected, and controlled, the hearth became the stable center of the longhouse, quietly feeding warmth into every other system surrounding it. Modern culture celebrates survival as an individual test. Endurance alone. Strength alone. Willpower alone. Viking survival followed a different logic. It was communal. Inside the longhouse, sleeping benches stretched along the walls from one end of the hall to the other. Families slept side by side, not for comfort or intimacy, but for thermodynamics. Heat loss depends on exposed surface area. When bodies share space, that surface area shrinks. Warmth circulates between people instead of leaking into the cold. Children were placed between adults, shielded by larger bodies that absorbed and redistributed heat. Elders occupied protected positions where drafts were weakest and warmth most stable. Bedding was layered with intention. Straw, hides, wool, each material slowing heat loss, each body contributing to the system. These were not private beds. They were human heat banks. Every arrangement reduced waste. Every position mattered. Warmth was not something owned by one person. It was something maintained by the group. Survival was never about personal toughness. It was about shared warmth, shared responsibility, and understanding that in winter, isolation is the fastest way to freeze. Perhaps the most counterintuitive element of Viking winter survival was smoke itself. In the longhouse, ceilings were kept deliberately low. Smoke rising from the hearth did not disappear immediately into a tall chimney. Instead, it gathered beneath the rafters, forming a thick, warm layer overhead. This smoky ceiling acted as a thermal buffer, slowing the upward escape of heat and keeping warmth where human bodies actually lived. The effects were immediate and measurable. Warm air lingered. Drafts softened. Cold air struggled to descend into the living space below. The roof no longer bled heat instantly into the winter sky. There was a cost. Eyes burned. Lungs adapted. Clothing absorbed the scent of smoke. But the trade-off was survival. Airflow inside the longhouse was not left to chance. Women of the household managed it daily, adjusting roof vents, tending embers, and balancing heat against oxygen with skill refined across generations. Too much smoke and breathing suffered. Too little and heat vanished. This was not neglect. It was control. Smoke was not pollution in the modern sense. It was insulation. And in a world where winter punished every mistake, that thin, smoky layer beneath the roof quietly saved lives. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Modern heating systems have trained us to ignore physics. Electricity hides inefficiency. Central heating allows energy to be wasted without consequence right up until the moment it fails. As long as the grid is stable, we rarely ask how heat moves, where it escapes, or how fragile our comfort really is. When that system collapses, the weakness becomes visible. Many modern homes perform worse than ancient ones. High ceilings bleed warmth upward and away. Thin walls leak air relentlessly. Fireplaces pull heat straight out of the house instead of keeping it inside. Space is large, open, and thermally expensive. Viking homes were built on the opposite logic. Space was compressed to reduce loss. Heat was stored instead of chased. Warmth was shared rather than isolated. Airflow was respected and controlled. Nothing about this was accidental. These choices were refined through generations of survival, shaped by winters that punished waste and rewarded efficiency. This was not primitive living. It was adaptation, sharpened by reality. And when modern systems fail, that difference becomes impossible to ignore. The Vikings did not survive winter through myth, brute strength, or blind luck. They survived by understanding systems. They understood that heat is precious. That space determines survival. That materials carry memory. That community is not optional, it is structural. Every decision inside a Viking longhouse reflected one core truth. Winter is not defeated. It is managed. Warmth is not generated endlessly. It is captured, slowed, stored, and shared. And that brings us back to the question that closes the circle. If people 1,000 years ago could design homes that turned blizzards into survivable seasons, what excuses do we have today? At Primal Heritage, we do not look backward to romanticize hardship or glorify suffering. We look backward to recover intelligence that has been buried beneath convenience. Knowledge that once kept families alive through darkness, cold, and uncertainty. Resilience is not about returning to the past. It is about remembering what worked and understanding why it worked. Because in a world growing colder, more fragile, and increasingly dependent on systems that fail without warning, those old lessons may be far more modern than we are ready to admit.